Why don't we get started then? Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Orly Burlov. I'm from PreVeil, and I'd like to welcome you to all today to our webinar, Accelerating CMMC Compliance, a faster, less expensive, and low-risk path to CMMC compliance, brought to you by Amazon Web Services, Coalfire Federal, and PreVeil. This webinar today will focus on solutions for helping defense contractors and higher ed institutions achieve CMMC Level 3 compliance. That's those organizations who are handling CUI, rather than those seeking CMMC Level 1 or Level 2 compliance. Let's begin with a problem statement today. So it is well understood that CMMC compliance is complex and requires significant effort. It is also understood that those seeking Level 3 compliance must first meet all 110 NIST 800-171 compliance requirements, as well as the 20 additional ones from CMMC. And as we also know, there's no partial credit. You either pass or you fail. Adding to the challenge, and per CMMC, you need to have strong security platforms to protect CUI. And organizations seeking compliance will have to budget for the security, as well as the consulting, technology, and processes to achieve CMMC Level 3. So what is a contractor to do? How does a contractor achieve compliance while realizing the complexity and decreasing complexity, decreasing cost, and decreasing the risk of CMMC Level 3 compliance? To answer this question and to go into depths on this issue, we are joined by three industry leaders today, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. Let me get to my next slide. So we are first joined, we'll be first turning to Stuart Itkin from Coalfire Federal. Coalfire Federal provides cybersecurity services to many government entities and commercial organizations, helping them protect their mission-specific cybersecurity objectives. Coalfire Federal is the leading FedRAMP 3 PAO, a CMMC C3 PAO, and CMMC RPO. It's a lot of three-letter acronyms, and offers a full spectrum of cybersecurity risk management and compliance services. In addition, Stuart is currently the Coalfire Federal's VP of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance. He was previously VP Product Management and Marketing at ExoStar. He has held several roles as several executive roles in cybersecurity, and has been a lead mentor at Mach 37 Cyber Product Accelerator. Speaking next will be Ted Steffen from a company that needs no introduction, AWS, also known as Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services has been in the cloud since 2006, providing cloud computing services. Today, Amazon Web Services provides a highly reliable, scalable, low-cost infrastructure platform in the cloud, powering hundreds of thousands of businesses in over 190 countries around the world. Ted is currently a senior security partner strategist at AWS and has created Amazon's Authority to Operate program. He coordinates the AWS team focused on helping national security and defense customers who work on CMMC. In addition, Ed is a proud U.S. Air Force veteran and has served over 26 years in the U.S. Air Force. Third speaking will be my colleague, Sanjeev Verma at PreVeil. PreVeil is a simple, inexpensive, and secure SaaS platform for storing and sharing CUI. It's designed for the enterprise and is used by leading defense contractors for CMMC compliance, supply chain collaboration, and incident response. About Sanjeev, he is currently the co-founder and chairman at PreVeil. Previously, he was the co-founder of Airvana. He has held business leadership roles at Motorola and received his MBA from MIT and his BS in electrical engineering from the Delhi College of Engineering. With all these illustrious introductions out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Stuart Itkin, to get things started. Stuart, why don't you get us going here?
Well, great. Hey, Orly, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to join my fellow panelists and address the audience today. Just to kind of double click on point you made, I mean, we're certainly going to touch on the complexity of CMMC, the effort that's required for organizations seeking certification to be able to satisfy all of those requirements. And we'll talk about how it is that you can reduce the complexity and minimize the effort. But I think it's first really important for people to understand why CMMC is important. As a panel, when we got together to try to structure this conversation, Ted was the one who kind of emphasized and said, people really need to appreciate why this is important in order to really care about the complexity and the effort that's required. And in thinking about this, I realized, if we can go to the next slide, Orly, why CMMC is important. It really has a lot to do with submarines. And if we think about it, the U.S. submarine arsenal is really a powerful nuclear deterrent. And all of us kind of appreciate that our security, our safety as individuals, as a nation, is really dependent on the U.S. Navy's fleet of 72 active duty submarines to be able to fulfill their mission. And clearly, submarines are important to us and to our security. Well, if we think back, submarines also played a key role in World War II. The only difference is that they weren't our submarines. They were submarines. We can go back, please, Orly. They weren't our submarines, but they were submarines of the German military. Now, our effort in Europe required that we depended on a secure supply chain to be able to support our troops that were in the European theater. We needed to be able to transport supplies. We needed to transport fellow troops. And over the course of that, the United States and allies ran over 450 convoys across the North Atlantic. And these became the prime target of the German U-boat fleet. And in the early parts of the war, over 350 US and allied ships were sunk. Tens of thousands of lives were lost. And the submarine warfare remained a very effective part of the German military effort until their ability to fulfill their mission was hampered by their cryptography being stolen. And so that information like fleet location and so forth could no longer be securely shared. And so if we go to the next slide. So it's really Alan Turing tells us why CMMC is important. For those of you who may have seen the movie The Imitation Game, Alan Turing was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And while he didn't exactly steal the cryptography, he did create a computer system called the bomb based on a stolen Enigma machine. And this enabled his team to decode messages up to about 84,000 of them on a monthly basis, so that we knew precisely the location and the activities of the German fleet, but they were unaware that we had this information. And as a effect, we simply rendered the German U-boat fleet ineffective. They were unable to control their mission. We simply just sent our convoys around where we knew their devices or where their ships were located. And again, this is kind of credited with saving tens of thousands of lives and bringing a swifter end to World War II. And I started saying that the submarines are important to us as well. And so just like Germany did, we depend on our nuclear arsenal of submarines to be able to fulfill their mission to assure our safety. And just as the Germans did, we depend on our nuclear submarine fleet to be able to communicate privately without their information being stolen. But just like the Germans, the cryptography on which our communications are based had been compromised and was stolen. So if we go to the next slide. Thanks. The only difference, unlike the Germans, where we were able to use their cryptography against them, we were able to detect this particular incident. In June of 2018, the Washington Post reported an event called Sea Dragon. And Sea Dragon involved the theft of 614 gigabytes of data that was stolen from a United States defense contractor by foreign adversaries, and included the theft of undersea warfare data, plans for submarine based communications, but it also involved the theft of our sensor and cryptography information. And if we only imagine what would have happened if this particular breach had not been detected and we didn't have the ability to react to it, would we find ourselves in the same position as the Germans were, with a fleet that we felt was able to secure its mission that we depended on, that in fact had been fully compromised and left us at risk? And this is far from the only example of theft from US defense contractors compromising our ability and safety as a nation, the safety of our warfighters. The Lockheed F-35 strike fighter represents another case in point. It took Lockheed Martin and its crew of subs almost a decade to develop the F-35. Total program cost over $1 trillion. And within 2 years of the introduction of the F-35, the Chinese introduced a plane called the J-31, which was virtually a carbon copy of the F-35 and was based on CUI, or controlled and classified information, that had been stolen by defense contractors. And this is really why CMMC was created, and it's why CMMC is important. If we can go to the next slide. So CMMC, was created to really enhance the protection of sensitive defense information, or what we refer to generally as CUI, controlled unclassified information, and FCI, federal contract information. And it's not that we weren't trying to protect this information before. It's a matter of the steps that were taken just proved to be ineffective. And prior standard that was involved, NIST 800-171, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, just suffered in a number of respects. And first, it involved compliance. And compliance is not security. When somebody is responding to a compliance requirement, the tendency is to find the cheapest solution that exists that enables me to check the box, independent of whether it works or it doesn't work. Second, 800-171 provided for the use of a POAM. If there were a control that I had not satisfied, I could address that requirement simply by promising or writing a plan of action in milestones to satisfy that. But certainly promising to secure something is far less effective than actually securing it. Promising to put a lock on my front door and closing it, is not as safe as actually putting the lock on the door and locking it. POAMs also put those that complied at a disadvantage. If there were two organizations, one that said, I'm going to invest in security and satisfy all the NIST 800-171 controls, well, we know that security has a cost associated with it. A competitor that chose to simply write a bunch of POAMs wouldn't have the same cost, wouldn't have the same operating expenses, and a result, their bid would likely be cheaper. Who would win when competing for a piece of business? Probably the organization that wrote POAMs rather than actually invested in security. And finally, 800-171 allowed organizations to kind of grade their own tests. It was based on self-attestation. I looked at the 110 controls and I judged for myself whether in fact I satisfied that. I found that people were just inclined to give themselves the benefit of the doubt, to kind of be a little bit more lenient and certainly inconsistent with respect to how things were graded. So if we go to the next slide. So CMMC was specifically created to address those deficiencies that existed within NIST 800-171. First, it's no longer about compliance. It's about maturity. It's not, have you done something? It's, have you done something? Are you using it? And is it working? In a prior company that I worked for, one of the products that we provided was for secure file sharing. It was a requirement of NIST 800-171. And we found that there were a number of organizations were purchasing the solution, but when we looked at the utilization statistics, we found that some of these had never been turned on. And so we checked in with these clients and said, was there a problem? And they said, no. He said, the requirement was that we have to have a means of providing secure file transfer. We can check the box, we have this solution. They weren't using it, they hadn't deployed it, but in fact, they had complied with the requirement. CMMC also does away with kind of grading your own test. It involves testing or certification by independent third parties called C3PAOs or CMMC third-party assessment organizations. And unlike NIST 800-171, which you could satisfy with a POAM, requirements in CMMC are pass-fail. They have to be satisfied, not just addressed. You can't promise to leave something, and every single one of those requirements needs to be satisfied. So let me go on and talk about what makes CMMC challenging. Why is there the effort? Why is there the cost that's involved? Orly, if we can have the next slide, please. So, unlike other compliance regimens, CMMC isn't about protecting systems. Now, we work a lot with FedRAMP. FedRAMP is about protecting a cloud application that is well contained and defined. CMMC is about protecting controlled, unclassified information. And the challenge within many organizations, that information can reside in many, many places. And this is especially true when we look at organizations that have both commercial and government business entities, and often find that they follow the same processes and procedures for government business as they do commercial business. And so that CUI can be located almost anywhere within their organization. And so the hard part with CMMC is really identifying where CUI is in the organization and then organizing it so that it can be effectively protected. It's a matter of looking at business processes. Business process defines where CUI exists. If the same business process is being used for commercial and government, those business processes may need to be separated. If it's the same people doing both of those, staff may need to be segregated to be able to do that. And then once that occurs, the IT which supports those business processes needs to be created. And so step 2 is really about building a safe home for that CUI. And this is something that when we look at the cost for an enterprise or a mid-market organization, this can be about a $500,000 investment in year 1 for a small and medium business. On average, it can be about $175,000 investment with annual reoccurring costs associated with that. But these are a part of the hard part of CMMC. Second thing that makes CMMC challenging, if we go to the next slide, is that it's a 100% conforming standard. Every requirement must be satisfied in order to be able to pass CMMC. And I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, only to point out that at level 3, which Orly referred to as the minimum level that an organization handling CUI needs to be certified at, involves 130 practices, and an organization needs to have policies, procedures, and plans to be able to support each of those practices. We can go on to the next slide. This is just kind of to provide a representation. So we've got across the top are the 17 CMMC domains, and underneath that, we have the practices that are involved. And again, every one of these needs to be satisfied in order to be able to achieve CMMC certification. And it needs to be supported with documentation and evidence that is adequate. Every requirement is covered, and it needs to be sufficient. And the bar for sufficiency in documentation is a very high one. If we look at kind of the color coding, just it kind of indicates that the orange bars are those practices that can be satisfied through policies or through procedures. The light blue generally involve configuration settings and security settings. The green and purple are hardware, software, and technology satisfied. And then the gold are generally satisfied by system requirements or configurations of hardware and software. We go to the next slide. I mean, if this looks like a lot, it actually gets harder, because each of these individual practices, like AC 1.001, limited information system access to authorized users, you can read the rest of it, actually has 6 independent requirements underneath it. And every one of these 6 requirements for AC 1.001 needs to be satisfied. It needs to be documented in the system security plan. There needs to be policies, procedures, and there needs to be evidence that is associated with it that can be provided that in fact shows that it is being done. And in total, if we were to expand this out, yes, there's 130 practices, but there's a total of 382 requirements that need to be satisfied. And so just a little bit of the insight in terms of the effort that Orly referred to and the cost that's involved with really addressing this. And what I'm really trying to do is shape and to give you some insight into what's the problem that needs to be solved in order to be CMMC compliant, to satisfy these requirements. So if we go to the next slide, we talk about, well, what is it that we can do to kind of, as an organization, minimize those costs, the risk, and the time that's associated with implementing or solving those problems of building out an environment or having an environment where COI can be safely handled. And generally, we see three things that can be helpful. One is to engage an advisor. The requirements for CMMC are exacting. There's not a lot of wiggle room for interpretation. If you want to understand the requirements in detail, the CMMC Level 3 Assessment Guide is a 430-page reference document that's available. That's the Bible. That's what needs to be achieved. You're best really served by bringing somebody in who understands those requirements and can provide you the guidance. Second, you can kind of stop and look and say, okay, how do I build this from scratch? But rather than looking and saying, okay, how do I solve this problem for myself? There are people who've gone and built out kind of blueprints, or generally what's referred to as a reference architecture that kind of does the heavy lifting and kind of builds the structure that you can simply plug devices or plug services into, or shows you where various systems components potentially lie. And the third, and one that we recommend strongly, is to share the responsibility and to be able to leverage cloud services, either infrastructure as a service, platformer as a service, or software as a service. And as a consequence, many of these requirements that we identified, kind of all those colored bars, some of those can be satisfied directly as a result of choosing a cloud service. So certain things, such as FIPS 140-2 or 140-2 validated encryption can be satisfied by selecting a software as a service offering that satisfies that requirement. Other requirements, again, can come as a result of simply using a cloud service. Others are shared responsibilities, meaning that some of it comes from the cloud service provider, but it leaves a customer responsibility. It may be how a configuration is set and so forth. But leveraging cloud can take a lot of the cost, a lot of the risk, and a lot of the time out of this. And a great example to be able to point to is the work that Amazon Web Services has done in building out its reference architecture and its cloud services. And so let me hand this over to Ted, who can talk how AWS is addressing this and helping organizations satisfy CMMC.
That pesky mute button. Orly, next slide, please. So let's initially talk about our GovCloud region. So we designed GovCloud a number of years ago to handle all of the international traffic and arms regulations that are out there. We manage the region simply with US citizens from an AWS perspective. We vet our customers that are requesting access into that region. And we take each and every service that gets launched in that region through the FedRAMP high authorization level, as well as the DoD impact 4 and 5 levels. GovCloud is an entirely separate, isolated credential database. So what that means is that you cannot use the same account that you use today in a commercial region to access GovCloud. You have to request a separate account there and set up your identity and access management there. The regions are physically isolated. So we have a region on the West Coast in Oregon and another region in Ohio. And each of these regions have 3 separate availability zones. So that gets you this idea or notion of separate network isolation, as well as redundancy and fault tolerance. We force all users in our GovCloud region to run in virtual private clouds or VPCs. And we also provide FIPS 140-2 validated hardware and cryptographic services in the GovCloud region. So one of the things that Stuart touched on. One of the unique things for us is that the services are deployed into the GovCloud regions based upon customer demand. So just because we deploy something in our commercial region doesn't mean we're necessarily going to land that in GovCloud. We have to have the appropriate level of customer demand to put it there. This allows us to keep our costs down and be able to pass that on to customers. Orly, next slide. And yeah, go back one. I just want to make that final call out at the bottom. While GovCloud is managed and operated by U.S. citizens, from a security level, it is the same as all of our other regions. But we don't have that same level of administrative access. So we do manage the other regions through follow the sun support and don't restrict it to just US persons. Next slide, Orly. And so Stuart touched on the notion of a reference architecture. And from an AWS perspective, that's going to be our AWS compliant framework. This is kind of a graphical representation here that we'll kind of dig into a little bit more. So next slide. So there's 4 main points that we want to talk about when we talk about the AWS compliant framework. All of the infrastructure that is used to deploy this is all based upon code. And so you have the ability to completely deploy this framework through the use of CloudFormation, as well as the AWS CDK or Cloud Development Kit. It deploys the account structure in such a manner that meets the requirements that are defined within CMMC. We aggregate AWS environment logs for all the security and event management identities out there, so that they can be pulled into a SIM or a security information event management system, including all of the logging around accounts that are provided to accessing the reference architecture or the framework. And we pull that all into an area that has this notion of immutable logs. So they're going to be there. They can't be changed, and they'll be the truth. And all of that runs on the Amazon Simple Storage Service, or Amazon S3. It also gives you the ability to do continuous auditing. So instead of where historically you would, everybody would go through an assessment on a periodic basis. You prepare for the assessment, you do the assessment, you pass the assessment, and you go back to business as usual. And then, next time assessment time comes around, you go through that same exercise where you prepare, you assess, and go back to business as usual. With what we've developed here, it gives you the ability to do what's called continuous auditing. So through the use of services such as AWS CloudTrail, AWS Config, as well as additional AWS services, you have that ability to continuously audit your environment 24/7 in real time. And one of the other additional advantages here is that we've developed this to be extensively expandable through the notion of plug-in architecture, APIs, automation of inputs and outputs. We store a lot of this stuff in our AWS Systems Manager parameter store, allowing customers the ability to modify any information about the system or correct flaws that may come up. And we make this all available via an open source project hosted in GitHub. So it's all fully transparent and available for our customers and partners to take advantage of. Next slide, Orly. So So now let's touch on the notion of inheritance, and Stuart was leaning into this a little bit through part of his presentation, and we've kind of outlined all of the various different domains that are required here, as well as the number of practices within each domain. Orly, if you want to switch to the next slide. So whenever you're leveraging the work that we've done with this controlled working environment or this reference architecture that we've created, working with Coalfire, we've done a review, and based on that review, there are a number of the 130 CMMC level practices that are allowed to be inherited from AWS. Based upon, again, that work that Coalfire has done, there's 61 that should be able to be directly inherited from AWS, 52 that are going to be shared, and we'll dive in a little bit deeper as to what these are, and then finally there are 17 that the customers are fully responsible for. And one of the things I like to make sure that to level set on when we're talking about this is that when you're discussing inheritance, and whether something can be fully inherited or partially inherited from AWS, it's simply going to depend upon the amount of the system that's running in Amazon. So if you've got a portion that's running on GovCloud as part of this AWS reference architecture, and you still have a portion that's still running on premises in one of your own data centers, then you will still have to address some of those 61 controls that would normally be inherited from AWS. You'll have to address those for the portion that's running on premises. Next slide, Orly. So at a high level, the practices that you're able to inherit from AWS are going to be around the maintenance domain, the media protection domain, and the physical protection domain. So what this means is that we at AWS are going to take care of all of the hardware maintenance. We're going to ensure that all the preventive maintenance is done. Any failed hard drives or failed memory modules or things like that are appropriately taken care of. They're appropriately sanitized as we move into the media protection side of the domains, and ensure that all of the media that enters into one of our AWS regions meets the sanitization requirements of the compliance program that's subjected to that region. And then, of course, we're going to also take care of the physical security. So the guns and the gates and the guards, and making sure that visitor logs are maintained, as well as emergency power and diversity of network connections. So, Orly, next slide, please. And then we get into the CMMC shared practices. So what does AWS do versus what do you do? And so a couple of areas to think about here is patch management, for example. We will make sure that all of our infrastructure has all the appropriate patches installed and applied at the appropriate intervals based upon, if we're talking about GovCloud, the FedRAMP patching requirements. Configuration management, we're going to make sure that our side of configuration management and the regions are maintained in such a way that meets the requirements. And then we train our employees. And so if we flip this all around, then you as the partner or customer will have to ensure that your systems are patched to meet your compliance requirements. You'll have to ensure that your configuration management is in place and is being followed. And you'll have to ensure that you're training your staff based upon the requirements of CMMC. Next slide. And then, there are a handful of these customer-specific CMMC practices. And so one example here would be, how do you get data into and out of the environment? And where will that data be stored? And that may be implemented through some sort of zone security or service communication protection. And so you may be, based upon your compliance requirements and your customer, you may need to route that data to a specific security environment that is, defined either within your contract or your compliance program. So next slide. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sanjeev to talk about how he pulls this all together with PreVeil.
Thanks very much, Ted. And I'm going to try and provide a perspective on how PreVeil, brings together all the points that were made by Stuart and Ted into a system that is easy for a small to medium business to implement without going through all of the extraordinary complexity that has been certainly shared. And so let's start with the fundamentals and recap what Stuart said. Stuart articulated that the CMMC is about securely and compliantly storing and sharing CUI. You got to protect your controlled and classified information. And for most organizations, the controlled and classified information will be substantively in the form of electronic mail messages and documents, files, design documents, communications about controlled and classified information, etc. So the fundamental must-have systems are systems that are some form of a file sharing and storage system to store your CUI and electronic mail to share them. And the first fact that we have to understand is that the basic systems that most SMBs use are things like Office 365 Commercial or some form of an Exchange server platform or some sort of a Dropbox, etc. And from a CMMC perspective, those are non-compliant. You cannot use them because they don't comply with CMMC requirements. So what are the options available to an organization to now take care of storing, sharing, communicating, working with suppliers with controlled and classified information? So PreVeil is an encrypted email and document collaboration system that enables you to do so. The first point I'll say about it is built on top of AWS GovCloud. So all of the benefits that Ted had articulated of AWS GovCloud come to you through the use of PreVeil, because all of your CUI is stored and shared in a compliant manner on AWS GovCloud. So what is PreVeil? The first part of PreVeil is what we call PreVeil Drive. It's a document collaboration system. It looks, feels very much like OneDrive or Google Drive or Dropbox. So you can simply drag and drop your CUI and store it. It's automatically stored on AWS. You can share it. And email is just standard email. You'll keep your email address, and within your Outlook or Gmail, you can send and receive encrypted emails, again using FIPS 140-2 in a simple manner, and that's PreVeil's encrypted email capability. So how does this simplify CMMC compliance? So let's dig into the details a little bit. Back to what both Stuart and Ted articulated. If you are striving for CMMC Level 3 compliance, there are 17 domains and 130 cyber practices. So do you want to now take the effort to meet those? And once you determine yes, you've got basically three choices available to you. One, you build a system on premise all by yourself that meets all these 130 cyber practices. And that's a tall undertaking, a very complex undertaking to stitch this thing together, and essentially not available to anybody except the most sophisticated organizations. The second is to say, well, I can't use my Office 365 Commercial or G Suite. So there are alternatives available, GCC High being one of them, where you rip what you've got and replace it with a compliance system such as GCC High. And the third alternative is what PreVeil on AWS GovCloud provides, which is keep your existing system and overlay it quickly and rapidly so that you keep your Office 365 and G Suite and overlay PreVeil so that you now have a system on your computers and mobile phones, etc., from which you can share information, store information, email information. And then let's look at how that system provides you with CMMC coverage. So the very same 17 domains and controls, if you look at them, the first I draw your attention to is the ones in gold. So these are physical protection, maintenance, media protection, etc. And as Ted articulated, since PreVeil is built on AWS GovCloud, you simply inherit the controls under the constraints that Ted had described for meeting CMMC requirements. So you get a substantial number of requirements. Second, since PreVeil was from the grounds up designed to protect your CUI in email and file sharing, the boxes in green, you inherit the controls by the use of the PreVeil system. So you've deployed PreVeil, so now you start getting several of your compliance controls met through the use of PreVeil. But the use of PreVeil alone does not get you to CMMC compliance, and I'm going to repeat that a few times. But when you use PreVeil, the boxes in green, the domains in green, and the controls in green can be met, or rather I should say light green, through shared policies and procedures and the use of PreVeil. So you have some policies and procedures, you use PreVeil, and the combination of policies and procedures and PreVeil provides you with the ability to meet the controls in the boxes or domains that are in light green. And that finally leaves you with the boxes in blue. And those are, again, mostly policies and procedures, and those you got to work to achieve. And that's why, again, the point that Stuart made, you need to have a trained expert to kind of guide you through those. To give you an idea about the number of controls that you meet through using PreVeil, it's about 83. And so the combination of PreVeil and AWS gets you a substantive way forward in meeting the 130 CMMC controls. So what allows us to offer you compliance, number one, we're a cloud-based service, as you could guess, based on AWS GovCloud. And there are specific rules that any cloud service that you use for CMMC compliance must satisfy. So PreVeil, for example, satisfies FedRAMP baseline moderate equivalent. That's what every cloud service needs to be. So we've done all that work. You don't need to do that. We store and share all your data in a fully encrypted manner on AWS GovCloud, which is FedRAMP High. So you don't need to do any of the work associated with configuring, working with the AWS GovCloud. All of it comes packaged. We satisfy all of the FIPS 140-2 encryption algorithm requirements, because all of the information in your files and in emails is all FIPS 140-2 validated. It's taken care of by us. And also there are details in terms of, many of you focus on DFAR 7012 C through G, the ability for you to provide the government with access to the information and logs, etc. And we satisfy that. And I would also note that not only is the system for CMMC compliance, but it also, the same system supports ITAR data and is obviously rooted in NIST 800-171 compliance. So let's start with, if you are a business or you're an educational institution, how do you start? Well, the very first thing that you need is a system security plan. As was articulated earlier, you need to document and show that you're meeting the controls, you provide objective evidence for it, and the document that does so is called a system security plan. So again, as a reference, system, if you use PreVeil, PreVeil provides you with very detailed CMMC documentation that gets you a head start in preparing your system security plan. So it's a 200-page document. It goes line by line and says, here are the 83 to 85 controls that PreVeil helps you meet. here is the documentation associated with those controls, why it meets them, and standard policies and procedures so that you do not have to do the work associated with this. This is, again, a very detailed amount of work, and it was done, again, by third-party CMMC compliance experts. So you simplify your effort, first, by deploying a system like PreVeil that gives you compliance controls, and secondly, it simplifies by providing you reference documentation so that you don't have to go and develop it yourself. I should again emphasize that you still do need a strong CMMC advisor to address the rest of those controls. And again, an entity, for example, like Coalfire can, assist and simplify it because they're familiar with PreVeil, they understand the controls that we address, and they can sort of rapidly go and focus on the controls that are outstanding for the rest of your organization. Let's also now speak about security, because ultimately it's all about protecting controlled and classified information with the highest levels of data security. And PreVeil essentially adopts an approach that is based on what we call zero trust. So unlike traditional systems, we take a modern approach to security where we assume, and this may sound paradoxical, that PreVeil will be breached, that passwords will be breached, that admins will be breached, and yet your information remains secure. And here's how that is accomplished. So in a traditional system like your Office 365 email, as an example, you send it encrypted in transit, it's stored encrypted at rest, delivered to the receiving company servers, and so forth. But as you noticed with the recent Exchange server breaches and others, these servers have the ability to look at undecrypted or decrypted information. And so therefore, so can the attacker. Attackers are sophisticated. And as the National Security Agency says, you got to assume that they will get to those servers. So how do we protect your information even when the servers will be compromised? It's using a technique called end-to-end encryption. So with PreVeil, all your CUI in the form of emails and files is encrypted on your computer or on your phone. It stays encrypted on AWS GovCloud servers and is delivered to the recipient. A key difference is that the information is never decrypted on the GovCloud server. So it's never accessible to PreVeil. It's never accessible even to Amazon. And if an attacker compromises those servers, you basically get encrypted gibberish, no keys to decrypt them. And so that's the foundation for the security of your controlled and classified information. Second, a whole slew of controls and a whole slew of protection revolves around protecting passwords, because as you know, they are vulnerable to guessing, phishing, and spoofing. And that's what the attackers use to get at your information. So a PreVeil system, again, built on AWS GovCloud, doesn't use passwords. We actually use an encryption key as your identity. And this key is stored on your devices. You don't need to do anything. It's automatically done for you. And there are two key benefits. Unlike a password, your encryption key authentication is unguessable by modern technology. No amount of computers can guess it. And secondly, by tying the key to your devices, you restrict access to your controlled and classified information only to your devices or your authorized devices. And you cannot sort of remotely log in just as you can do with sort of standard systems. And so that's the second level of protection. Third, the worst attacks occur if an admin is compromised. And on a PreVeil system, you've got an admin, but an admin needs permission, and it's cryptographic, from multiple other admins before they can access the information. So sort of like our nuclear launch codes, your access key is split up and distributed amongst the admins. And only when the right number of admins that you specify approve, then the key can be reconstructed so the admins can do their job, but even if compromised, cannot essentially pass on the information. And then finally, the system also gives you the ability to restrict your CUI access to your trusted community, which is your organization, folks within your organization that are authorized to have access to the information, and perhaps your suppliers if you're communicating with the supply chain. And again, it's a simple system because it doesn't require any rip and replace. It leverages the power of AWS GovCloud. You keep your Office 365 and G Suite. And since we require no changes to your existing system, you can deploy the system in an hour. So in this manner, you essentially get the power of a system that leverages the AWS platform, gives you the compliance, gives you the security, and yet is simple for you to deploy, inexpensive for you to deploy and maintain. And so there you have it. This is how we kind of bring it together. And with that, I will move on to question and answers that you may have for any of us.
Well, thank you very much, Sanjeev, for taking the time to give us that great walkthrough of PreVeil. There have been a number of questions that came through, and I'll go ahead and go through them. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Sanjeev.
Yep.
Yep. All right. Great.
I'm not sharing my screen anymore.
You're not sharing. Great.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get started with the questions. All right. Stuart, why don't we get started with you? You've had the most time to kind of think and hear everyone else. So I want to get this question towards you. It says, I repeatedly hear the message of start now in terms of compliance, get started on my CMMC compliance now. If most contracts that require CMMC are 2 to 3 years away, what's the hurry?
So I think that's a great question. I hear that question in a lot of different forums, and there's a couple of components to the answer. One, despite using a low risk, accelerated approach, preparing for CMMC is something that takes a great deal of time. On average, organizations can expect that their journey to be able to satisfy CMMC requirements is going to be not less than 6 months, and in some cases, depending to their baseline, considerably longer than a year to be able to get there. Second, it's about demonstrating maturity. It's not a matter of saying, okay, I'm done, I've written my policy, I can show it to the assessor tomorrow. The assessor wants to see that you've done fire drills. If you have an incident response policy, you've actually exercised that policy with tabletop exercises and so forth. All of this takes time to be able to achieve. The other is a little bit more pragmatic. While the government is setting the timeline for contracts, we're seeing a lot of prime contractors who are very sensitive about the risk they take on in a bid team or the risk they take on in a project, trying to push CMMC Level 3 requirements to their subcontractors ahead of it becoming a government requirement, simply because they know that a supplier who has satisfied the CMMC requirements at Level 3 represents a smaller risk to them and to the project as a whole than a supplier that has not. So expect to see pressure coming from the suppliers. And if there's a third one, there's some suppliers that are savvy enough to say, if I accelerate my compliance and I'm competing against an organization that is not CMMC certified, I represent a more attractive alternative. So these are the kinds of things that are really causing people to look at this and say, I need to get started now and I need to proceed very deliberately.
Thank you, Stuart. That was a great answer. Ted, let's have you jump in with the next question, because it's really something that I think is perfect for you with your AWS lens. What's the difference between FedRAMP, DoD, and CMMC? I got tripped up, I have to admit, in the introduction over all the 3-letter acronyms, but I assume I'm not the only one. And so, FedRAMP and DoD authorized systems, CMMC certifies organizations. Why don't you play our guide here and give us a little bit of context to this alphabet soup?
Absolutely, Orly. Yeah, the federal government and the DoD would be nothing if it wasn't for TLAs, or 3-letter acronyms.
Because then we know what they were doing, and we might actually tell them to stop.
Yeah, that could be true. Yeah, so when you think about, system authorization such as FedRAMP and DoD, and Stuart touched on this a little bit through his presentation, they're very well defined boundaries. There are prescribed entry and exit points. There are, very specific systems that are included as part of that. And so when you go through a DoD impact level 4 or 5 authorization or a FedRAMP, low, moderate, high, or low impact, it's looking specifically at what's defined within that system boundary. It doesn't include other things such as, maybe your HR system, or perhaps a ticketing system, or your customer relationship management system. It focuses just purely on that system itself. But so when we flip the lens on this and start talking about CMMC, CMMC is a maturity model certification. So, and it's looking at your entire organization. Now, you are, as we understand today, allowed to, create silos where you're going to store this FCI or CUI, more 3-letter acronyms for you there, Orly. Then you're allowed to, in some cases, stovepipe them off or firewall them off from some of your other areas. But CMMC is really targeted at an organizational certification as opposed to what FedRAMP and DoD are looking at from a system authorization.
Right. And I think one thing that constantly needs to be reiterated when you talk about CMMC is that it is maturity, right? And this goes to what Stuart knows very well, that is looking at how well companies or contractors have ingested those requirements and how well they've lived them. I know we're almost out of time, but I do want to, in the vein of fairness, give Sanjeev a question that I know many people ask, and that is, has an organization passed a DIPCAC audit by leveraging PreVeil? And if so, how?
So the short answer of that is that no organization has gone for a CMMC level 3 before DIPCAC. But the very first organization that DIPCAC audited using PreVeil was for NIST 800-171, which involved 110 of the 130 controls. And we are very pleased to share that the organization achieved outstanding results. They basically came out with meeting 109 out of the 110 controls. And again, this was not just solely PreVeil, but the organization used PreVeil as its core system for storing and sharing CUI. So I think that represents an excellent data point in terms of having a rock solid basis for NIST 800-171 compliance, and should offer comfort to organizations that then want to take the 110 controls and add the remaining 220 for CMMC.
Right, and also small plug, we have a case study kind of documenting that particular journey. Well, I do realize it is 2 after the hour of 2. We've run a little bit over. Thank you for those of you who have stayed to the bitter end and listened to our very important discussion on accelerating CMMC compliance. I'll give it to our speakers to just sign off, and thank you for attending. All right.
Thanks, Orly.
Thank you, everyone. This has been great.